This is the tale of the Sangreal, or the tale of the Holy Grail, by Sir Thomas Malory. This comes from Le Morte d'Arthur, the definitive piece of Arthur myth. One day at Camelot, Lancelot and all the other knights are there, but Lancelot decides he wants to go out and seek adventure. So he leaves Camelot behind and goes out riding and finds a castle that is under distress. It is under distress because an evil dragon has been attacking it recently. Lancelot, being the greatest of knights, succeeds where no other knight could, and he battles with the dragon and ultimately kills the dragon. As a hero, he is given a hero's welcome in the castle, and a huge feast is given that night, and he's even introduced to the king's daughter, the beautiful Lady Elaine. Lady Elaine sees Lancelot, and knowing that Lancelot is the greatest of all knights, immediately falls in love with him. However, Lancelot does not feel the same way about Elaine. Lancelot is in love with Guinevere, his own queen, and of course Arthur's wife. Because of that, he is remaining chaste, except for, of course, his relationship with Guinevere, an adulterous relationship. But that night, Lancelot is tricked. Through magic, he believes that it is Guinevere that enters his bedchamber while he sleeps at this castle. But in actuality, it is the Lady Elaine, and this affair is consummated. Lancelot leaves the castle the next day, flees away from it, knowing he's been tricked. 18 years later, two monks arrive at Camelot. They're like, "Hey, Lancelot, we need you to come with us." Lancelot, not knowing what the meaning of this is, decides that he will go with the monks. So he travels with the monks. And the monks lead him to a castle, one that looks shockingly familiar. Once he gets there, he is introduced to Galahad and asked to make Galahad a knight. Lancelot, needing to know, of course, of his lineage, asks, "Well, who's your daddy?" Galahad responds, "You are." Then Lancelot realizes everything that's happened and just says, "Oh." And at this point, then, he does knight Sir Galahad. Back at the round table, everyone is feasting, everyone is having a great time, and Lancelot does return. And of course, most of the seats at the round table, as we see in this picture, are full. However, there are always a few that are empty because knights are out on adventure. And there's one chair in particular that has never been filled. The Siege Perilous. The Siege Perilous is a chair that is the most coveted of all the chairs at the round table. But there is legend that anyone who sits in it that is not truly worthy will die. It is the chair that is to be sat in by the Grail Knight, the greatest knight that will achieve the quest of the Holy Grail. Well, that night, back in Camelot, they are having this big feast, and Galahad does show up, and at this point, new lettering is seen on the Siege Perilous that says he ought to sit here, and eventually even Sir Galahad's very name is seen on the chair. That night, as they continue to feast, in front of everyone appears the Holy Grail, and all plates are filled, all cups are filled, and it's a glorious feast, and everyone is just in marvel of the fact that the Holy Grail has been seen there. Because of this, all the knights, starting with Sir Gawain, but then with everyone else, they all decide they're going to go out to find the Holy Grail. To this, Arthur's like, "Oh no," because he realizes this is a mission that is of great importance. And while he certainly would want some knights to go out and try to achieve this, for all of his knights to go is very dangerous. And he knows that there is a good chance that many of his knights will not come back, and that this could be the beginning of the end for the Round Table. As we move on in our story, Galahad actually ends up getting several very important artifacts. At the very beginning of the story, outside Camelot, a rock with a sword in it is found in a river outside of Camelot. It says on the blade that only the greatest knight can pull this sword, that it belongs to him. First, Lancelot is asked if he will draw the sword, and he says that he does not believe he is the greatest knight. So he refuses. Gawain is given the next shot, and Arthur begs Gawain to do it because he wants to see someone try to pull the sword. Gawain does not believe he is the greatest knight either, but he attempts to pull the sword, and he doesn't. Eventually, after Sir Galahad arrives, they go back out to the stone, and Sir Galahad pulls the sword and receives his first weapon, because at this point, Sir Galahad has armor, but he has no sword and no shield. As they all depart to go on the quest for the Holy Grail, they come across a tower, of which there is a knight. One random knight just happens to take the shield, the magic-looking shield that he finds there. But this knight that is defending it chases after him and attacks the knight that took it and brings the shield back. Because this shield is, of course, Galahad's shield. The cross is actually blood from the famous saint Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea was a saint that supposedly brought the Holy Grail all the way to Great Britain. And Joseph of Arimathea, when he was close to death, at one point he basically sneezed on the shield and then wiped the blood that he sneezed onto it in the shape of a cross. Disgusting? Yes. But this is supposedly the blood of a saint that is found on this shield. As they continue on, lots of things happen in this story. I'm keeping it very simple, but ultimately, 3 knights, Galahad, Percival, and Bors, all end up together, and they board this small boat where they find, among other things, another sword. This one, the Sword of Strange Girdles is what it is called. A strange name as well. But it also, on the girdle, basically says that only the greatest knight can pull this. Percival and Bors both try to pull it and fail. Galahad pulls it, and now he has an even more magical sword, and no longer needs this first sword. To backtrack a little bit and talk about some of the other knights. First of all, there is Gawain. He's basically pretty foolish in this. First of all, he tries to pull the sword out of the stone, but fails. Furthermore, at one point, he ends up against a group of knights that Galahad defeated but drove off, saving the people that were being enslaved by these evil knights. Gawain and a few of his brothers, Gareth being another one of them, they kill these 7 knights, who are actually symbolic of the 7 deadly sins. And when Gawain comes across a monk and asks if he could stay at this abbey for the night, the monk tells him that he's been very wicked and that he should not have killed the knights, that he should have let them live. That Galahad, the pure knight, let them live because that's what was supposed to happen. That murdering someone just for the sake of the fact that they're evil is wrong. That there must be an actual threat to actually kill them. So he is offered penance. Gawain basically is willing to confess his sins, but he does not want to do penance, saying that as a knight he suffers enough being out in the wilderness, and he thinks that there is no need for him to do penance. This is, of course, a foolish act, and ultimately things will not end well for Gawain. The end result for the overall story, as we move on, is that many of the Knights of the Round Table die in the mission of getting the Holy Grail. 2 other very important knights, Gawain and Lancelot. One of them, Lancelot, well, let's start with Gawain, actually. Gawain is, of course, he tries to pull the sword, and on the sword it does say that anyone who pulls it that is unworthy shall be injured by it. Now, of course, when the next thing that happens actually happens, Gawain is in full armor, but he ends up in battle against Galahad at one point. Galahad does not realize it is Gawain, because these knights do change armor and disguise themselves quite often, and Gawain is disguised at this point. But Galahad, with that same sword, strikes Gawain in the head and injures him mortally. Gawain does eventually survive, but his mission for the Holy Grail at this point is ended. Lancelot's mission goes on beyond that. He ends up meeting with Galahad at one point, and they have a wonderful time together, but then they do split up again, and Lancelot is actually the first one to come across the castle in which rests the Holy Grail. However, Lancelot is a sinner. He's been living in sin by having an affair with Queen Guinevere for many, many years. And he actually sees the Grail. He is warned not to approach it, that he is not worthy. But he sees something, he sees images, and he feels that there is someone that is in danger in there, and he wants to see the Grail beyond this. So he rushes in, and as he rushes into the chamber in which the Holy Grail is actually present, a holy flame covers him and burns him, injuring him to the point to where he's actually in a coma for nearly a month. he ends up in a coma one day for each year that he's had his affair with Queen Guinevere. The other characters, Galahad ultimately is successful, along with two other knights, Galahad, Percival, and Bors. They meet up at several points, they split up, but they keep meeting back up, and they end up all succeeding. They are the three most pure knights. Galahad is pure from beginning to end. He has no major sins. He does not have the sin of pride or lust or wrath, the three that are probably the biggest for these knights. And ultimately, he ends up even committing several miracles, healing some people that cannot walk, healing a leper or two at one point in a new city. After he achieves the Holy Grail, they take it to a new city where Galahad performs many miracles. And in the end, he ascends into heaven almost like a Christ figure. Sir Percival is our next one. Percival, also very successful, and he is also a pure knight. However, he's had problems with pride and greed at different points, but he is a pure knight. He is also a virginal knight, and he actually is successful in his mission because of that. At the end, after achieving the quest for the Holy Grail, he actually gives up his weapons. He also apparently gives up his right arm, and he actually takes on the role of being a monk. And he lives out the rest of his days preaching the Word of God. The last knight that succeeds is Sir Bors. Sir Bors actually succeeds, and he is less pure than the others because he has had one sinful relationship with a woman. And in many times he is actually seen as a white cow with a black spot on it, whereas the other two knights, Percival and Galahad, are simply all white. That black spot that is often talked about is actually symbolic of Bors' one sin. However, he has repented for it and made himself better. Bors is the one knight that actually stays as a knight, and he returns to Camelot where he tells the good news of everything that has happened. Ultimately, this story is a story about two different types of knights. The previous stories have made knights like Lancelot and Gawain the greatest knights. These are knights that have had many affairs, that have gone chasing women, that have entered tournaments and killed other knights simply for their own enjoyment. Of course, it's not really considered murder in these times because these knights would have been fought in fair battle, but by today's standards, that's exactly what it would be. It puts them up against knights like Galahad, Bors, and Percival, sacred knights, knights that don't go off killing just for fun, knights that, in the case of Galahad and Percival, remain virginal their whole life, or knights like Bors, who has had but one affair and who has repented for it. So thematically, what we're getting at here is the tale of the Sangreal brings a Christian ideal into the Arthurian storyline. Many previous storylines mostly covered knights whose main purpose in life was to entertain themselves by fighting and killing other knights and chasing after women. In addition to that, we also see that many of these old stories actually use pagan gods, and actually we'll talk about either ancient Greek or other gods that are not Christian, are not the Christian God. In addition, Sir Galahad is sexually pure and only raises his sword when it is necessary. And his ability to perform miracles and his ascension into heaven, he's a different kind of Christ figure than we've previously discussed, as he is virtually just Christ in plate mail armor. This has been the Tale of the Sangreal by Sir Thomas Malory. Thank you for listening.